now that we've hit the end of this story, I think we need to just maybe make a little separation, because what's coming next is very, very important. And maybe just like kind of a word, because there are so many, there's so many things we could say about this story. I think Leslie was bang on. If you didn't catch it earlier, Leslie was talking about, where's Dinah in all of this? I think by now we've come to, unfortunately, accept the patriarchal notion of the fact that men wrote and told this story. And of course, we don't get Dinah's perspective. And it's even more troubling that some of the classical commentaries actually try to pin blame on Dinah from the opening verse by saying that because she left the camp and went out to consort, to hang out, to visit with the women of the nearby communities outside of the family, that she was somehow to blame. I read a fantastic explanation of how it's actually a bad interpretation, and that Dinah should be praised for her outgoing nature, just as her mother, Leah, should be praised for her outgoing nature, not constantly compared or contrasted, rather, with Rachel as being lesser in every sense of the way. Leah is still one of the matriarchs. Dinah was her daughter, and Dinah had tremendous attributes. There's fascinating midrashim about Dinah, everything from her being locked in a chest by her father, which is crazy, to her being the wife of Job. So in the Talmud it's mentioned. So it's that Job lived during the time of Jacob and that his wife was Dinah. So there's some very fascinating things, but in the Torah, we don't get to hear from her. And last night I misquoted the writer, but it's Anita Diamant who wrote a book that called The Red Tent, which is based on this whole this whole episode, and I think trying to give us a little bit of a window into her perspective. So yes, right off the bat, a story where the men take over and we don't get to hear from Dinah at all. I mentioned the idea of the way the story treats Shechem, but I'd almost like to kind of talk about what Yaakov says at the very end, where he chastises Shimon and Levi, and he's worried, and they end up moving, coming up, spoiler alert, because of the way that the neighbors, the other nations around them, he mentioned specifically Haknani v'Haprizi, how they're going to act, you're going to bring shame, everything they did. Less about anything else. Jacob, in the text here, doesn't address anything else. That is his concern. And isn't it interesting that the Torah, presenting such an unflattering account, this story gets held over Shimon especially, but Shimon and Levi, when Jacob gives his deathbed blessing towards the end of this book, his deathbed blessing is like a rebuke of Shimon, a callback to this story. And then later, Shimon becomes the brother who really Midrash says that he's the one that goes after Yosef, that he's the one that says that we should throw Yosef in the pit, that he actually throws Yosef in the pit, that way later on, the tribe of Shimon is completely decimated because they're the ones, I can't remember if it's the golden calf or the Baal Peor incident, but they're the ringleaders in breaking away from, there's just a lot of bad karma, I guess if we could call it, that comes from Shimon, especially from this story. And Shimon and Levi as brothers, they need to be separated because they would get each other riled up. It's a very unflattering account. So all this to say, I wonder why the Torah would present this story and then give them the last word in the form of this rhetorical question, right? Jacob talks about the way that the others are going to see us. And they say, but what about our sister? I don't think anyone would take their side in this story. I certainly don't lean that way, but I do find it interesting that they get the last word, that it's open-ended. It's left up for us. The book of Jonah ends with a rhetorical question too. It's left for us, the audience, the reader, to we're forced to engage with the story, as uncomfortable as it may be. And that their motivation is their sister, or at least what they say their motivation is their love for their sister. It's a complicated story. I'm not the first person to try and unpack it, but I wanted to offer a few other thoughts there before we move on to the next two aliyot, because now the tone really shifts here. We're going to see basically a major moment in Yaakov's life. Now, remember, he already just had a major moment before all this when he wrestled with the angel. But if you've heard me talk about this before, there are a lot of critical scholars who almost paint the picture of the Torah, and especially Breshit, being woven together from two traditions. One tradition where God's name is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and one tradition where God's name is Elohim. And we see this a lot in where different stories seem to get repeated. The story with Hagar, the elements of creation, the story with the flood, where there's kind of an account with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh as Hashem, right, what we would say is Adonai when we read it of the Torah, and Elohim, right? This is obviously at odds with rabbinic tradition and reconciling them, but it is interesting looking at it from a literary almost kind of perspective, because we know that Jacob has had his name changed to Israel. But what we're about to read would suggest that no, it hasn't, not yet, and that it's being changed now.